Imagine a hillside grave in central Albania on an autumn morning. The soil is damp from last night's rain, and the archaeologist's trowel scrapes against something hard, not stone but bone. The crew has been working since sunrise, brushing away centuries of dirt from a skeleton that everyone on site assumed belonged to a rider from the Central Asian steppes. The body was laid out with objects that looked foreign, ornaments and tools that whispered of the distant East, maybe of the great empires of the Khazars or the Bulgars. The bones are carefully lifted, catalogued, and eventually a tiny drill bit takes a dust-fine sample from the petrous bone of the skull, the part that guards the inner ear, and often guards ancient DNA better than any treasure chest. The sample travels to a clean laboratory where technicians in sterile suits extract a faint trace of genetic material from a person who breathed their last more than 500 years ago. When the sequencer finishes its run and the data flickers onto a screen, the ancestry that lights up is not the stepwriter everyone expected. It is South Asian, the kind of genetic signature that ties this person not to the grasslands of Central Asia, but deep into the Indian subcontinent, to a population that would eventually spread across Europe under a name that would become both a proud identity and a target of relentless persecution. Just like that, a graveyard in Albania had held the oldest physical evidence of the Roma people anywhere on the European continent, a secret quietly folded into the earth all the way through the Ottoman centuries, the communist years, and into the 21st century without anyone knowing. That alone is the sort of plot twist that rewrites a few pages of history. Yet it is only one tremor in a much larger story that the genes of Albania have started to tell. A story that reframes an entire national origin tale. By the time you reach the end of what the DNA actually reveals, the mirror you thought you were looking into will show you a reflection that is both older and far stranger than the one you expected. Stay for the last piece of this mosaic, because the most personal part of what the genes whisper is not about ancient tribes at all. For centuries, a single question has hummed beneath every argument about Albanian origins, sometimes quietly, sometimes in a roar. Are Albanians the direct, unbroken descendants of the ancient Illyrians, the Western Balkan people who fought Roman legions, traded with Greek colonists, and left their names carved on limestone across the Adriatic coast, from Istria to the Bay of Kotor? Or is the real story more complicated? This is not an abstract puzzle for academic seminars. It touches land, language, identity, and the deep human need to know whether the voice your grandmother used to sing you to sleep echoes from a hearth that has burned in the same valley since the Bronze Age. DNA now lets us move beyond the old game of picking a single ancestor and polishing its statue. It lets us ask a narrower, testable question. How much of the genetic inheritance of living Albanians actually traces back to the people who inhabited the Western Balkans 3,000 or 4,000 years ago? And what happened in between? A team led by researchers from the University of Vienna and Harvard University, working with colleagues in Albania and across Europe, set out to answer exactly that. They gathered more than 6,000 ancient genomes from across Western Eurasia, a colossal library of bone-derived data stretching from the Neolithic to the Middle Ages, and they sequenced 74 new DNA samples from ethnic Albanians representing all the major dialect groups, Jeg, Tosk, and the transitional varieties between them. The study first circulated as a preprint in 2023 and was published in Nature Human Behavior. And right in the middle of its dense, careful pages lies a number that refuses to leave your head once you hear it. If you trace the main ancestral line of today's Albanians back through time, you do not find a clean, simple line. You find a small, resilient population that crystallized in a specific mountain refuge around 800 to 900 CE. That is at least 1,000 years before the name Albanian itself starts appearing in written records. This small group is the genetic eye of the needle through which all later Albanian ancestry passed, and to understand how they came to be, and who they carried with them in their blood, is to understand a story that shatters the simple version in the most satisfying way. The shape of that satisfaction is what I will lay out for you piece by piece, and the very last piece is the one that will shift your sense of who this story belongs to. Before the soil and the sequencers spoke, people had filled the silence with several well-rehearsed answers. The first and loudest is the one taught in schools and defended at dinner tables across the Albanian-speaking world. It says that Albanians are the direct, pure descendants of the Illyrians, period. According to this view, the Illyrian tribes who clashed with Philip of Macedon and later with Rome simply weathered every storm: Slavic migrations, Gothic incursions, Bulgarian empires, Ottoman centuries, and transmitted their ethnic essence intact into the modern Albanian nation. This is not a fringe claim. It is a cornerstone of national identity, and it has been argued from linguistic traces, ancient place names, and a reasonable geographical logic. The new genetic data both validates and quietly dismantles the simplest version of this belief. You will see exactly how that paradox resolves. A second explanation, weaker but persistent in some corners, points to the Caucasus as the true homeland of the Albanian language and people. The argument leans on a coincidence of nomenclature. There existed in antiquity a region in the Caucasus called Albania by the Romans, a completely separate entity from the Balkan Illyrians. A few armchair theorists have suggested that the ancestors of modern Albanians migrated from the Caucasus into the Balkans sometime in the early medieval period, bringing their language with them. The ancient genomes from the Western Balkans bury this idea so thoroughly that it practically leaves no dust behind. The genetic profile of early medieval Albanians does not show a fresh pulse of Caucasus ancestry arriving in the first millennium CE. Instead, it shows deep roots in the Western Balkan soil, stretching continuously back into the Bronze Age, with no need for a Caucasian detour. A third old story holds that Albanians are essentially a late Roman or early Byzantine mixture of whatever peoples happened to wash into the region. A multi-ethnic paste of imperial leftovers with no strong continuity from any single Iron Age group. The genetic evidence again says no, but with an unexpected twist. The continuity is real, specific, and statistically robust. Roughly 68 to 84% of the ancestry of those early medieval individuals can be modeled as deriving from Bronze and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans. That number is remarkably high, higher than what you see for most European populations when you compare their medieval to their Iron Age selves. Yet the continuity was carried by a relatively small group, not by a sprawling, unbroken nation of identical Illyrians stretched across the whole Adriatic seaboard. The genetic thread did not snap, but it had to pass through a narrow eye, and the size of that eye matters enormously. A fourth assumption, subtler and born mostly from the fog of early medieval history, places the origin of the Albanians somewhere far from the Adriatic coast, somewhere in the interior of the Central Balkans, maybe Dardania or the region around modern Niš, with a later migration toward the coast driven by Slavic pressure. The genetic data, especially the ancient samples from the mountainous zone spanning northern Albania, southwestern Kosovo, and parts of North Macedonia, suggests something different. The population that fed into the Proto-Albanian gene pool was already in that highland corridor, not on the move from far inland. The bones point to a deep-time home in the rugged terrain that later Albanian oral memory calls the Mountains of the Ancestors. With those older stories set aside, we can turn to the actual study that redrew the map. The research was led by a consortium of laboratories specializing in ancient DNA, including the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and Harvard's Reich Lab, in collaboration with Albanian archaeologists and the Institute of Archaeology in Tirana. The scale of the effort is difficult to exaggerate. The team did not just sequence a few dozen genomes and call it a day. They worked with a comparative dataset of more than 6,000 ancient individuals from across Western Eurasia, spanning a timeline from roughly 10,000 BCE all the way into the Ottoman medieval period. From the modern side, they collected saliva and blood samples from 74 ethnic Albanians, carefully chosen to represent the full dialectal range of the language, from the northern Gaig highlands to the southern Tosk lowlands, including speakers from North Macedonia, Kosovo, and the diaspora. The core method, in plain language, is a kind of ancestry dissection by fractions. The researchers take the DNA of a person who lived, for example, in the year 850 CE near modern Kukas, and they mathematically test which older populations, out of the 6,000-strong reference library, best explain the pattern of tiny genetic variants in that individual's genome. They repeat this for hundreds of ancient individuals, and then project the modern Albanian samples onto the same framework, asking which ancient groups contribute the most to the living people. It is the difference between squinting at a faded fresco and restoring its original pigments under multispectral light. Why had the question stayed unsolved for so long? Because the necessary ingredients were missing. High-quality ancient genomes from Albania itself, from the crucial Iron Age and early medieval periods, were virtually non-existent. Communal memory and classical texts gave traces, and linguists had reconstructed the shape of the ancestral language, but the biological thread that connects the speaker of Proto-Albanian to the modern teenager in Tirana was invisible. For decades, genetic studies of the Balkans could only gesture toward broad patterns because they lacked the high-resolution ancient samples from the exact time and place that mattered most. The researchers themselves, in the preprint and in the published paper, express a quiet sense of discipline about their results, because when you sequence the first solid ancient genomes from a population that carries such a weight of national feeling, you do not leap to conclusions. You run the numbers again, you blind the analysis, you test for contamination, you let the statistics punish your favorite hypothesis until only the stubborn truth remains. That is what they did, and what emerged from the data is a narrative in 6 escalating chapters that begins far south of Albania, in a Greek colony, and ends inside the cells of a living person. The first chapter takes us not to an Illyrian hill fort, but to an ancient Greek trading port on the coast of the Black Sea, where a single skeleton rewires the whole frame. In the early 2020s, ancient DNA was extracted from individuals buried in the necropolis of Apollonia Pontica, a Greek colony in modern Bulgaria. One genome in particular, from the early centuries CE, sat firmly inside the genetic constellation of the ancient Balkans. But when the researchers ran the ancestry proportions, it came back as closest to the profile that later appears in medieval Albania. This was not an Albanian individual in a Greek colony centuries before any such label existed, but rather a biological whisper that the genetic threads that would later weave into the Proto-Albanian fabric were already scattered across the eastern Adriatic and interior Balkans during Roman imperial times. The surprising side fact is that this individual carried a slight admixture from Anatolia, a reminder that even the most localized Balkan ancestry was never a sealed jar. Picture the early morning light slanting through the wooden scaffolds of the excavation trench, a conservator kneeling on a foam pad, using a sable brush to sweep soil from the left temple of the skull, and a colleague quietly noting that the burial goods include a thin silver fibula of a type usually associated with Thracian elites. The disconnect between the archaeological label and the genetic kinship is the whole point. The numbers put it bluntly. Present-day Albanians share more identical by descent segments with this Roman-era individual from the Black Sea coast than they do with Bronze Age individuals from the same geographic latitude but from a different genetic clade. And yet, this thread is still the faintest and most distant signal in the ancestry plot, a single candle in a dark room, because the next chapter brings the fire much closer to home. That second chapter begins with the Iron Age inhabitants of the Western Balkans, whose skeletal remains were recovered from burial mounds scattered across the Dalmatian coast and its hinterland. The study directly sampled genomes from these tumulus cemeteries, and when the results came back, they matched, in a statistically overwhelming way, the genetic core of the later medieval Albanian population. The surprise here is not simply that there is continuity, but that the continuity is asymmetrical. The Iron Age Western Balkan ancestry appears at very high levels, roughly on the order of 80% in the early medieval Albanian genomes, whereas other potential sources, such as Iron Age Central Balkan populations or Aegean Bronze Age groups, contribute much less. Imagine the physical scene inside a Dalmatian tumulus grave known as a gromila. The stone cairn is heavy and damp, and when the archaeologists lift the capstone, the skeleton beneath is curled on its side, a bronze serpentine bracelet still encircling the right forearm bone, the metal green with age. The femur of this individual, drilled for ancient DNA, yields a genome that would be almost indistinguishable from the genomes of the people living in the Kruja highlands 800 years later. By comparison, a contemporary Iron Age individual from deep inland Thrace shows a strikingly different genetic profile, one with far more ancestry derived from steppe pastoralists entering the lower Danube. The genetic distances are stark enough to be felt. The Western Balkan Iron Age group and the Proto-Albanian group sit next to each other on the ancestry map, separated by a genetic gap as narrow as the Strait of Otranto, while the Thracian and Central Balkan groups orbit farther away. This is the moment in the narrative where the national story of Illyrian descent finds its most solid genetic footing, but it is also the moment where the ground gets slippery, because continuity alone does not explain how a handful of Iron Age tribes became the Albanians of recorded history. To understand that, you need the next layer. The third chapter shifts the scene to the late Roman period, the 4th and 5th centuries CE, when the administrative structures of the empire still stretched across the Western Balkans, and Latin-speaking officials recorded the names of settlements, rivers, and peoples. At the site of a late Roman necropolis near modern Shkodër, excavators working with the Albanian Institute of Archaeology uncovered graves oriented east to west, with modest grave goods, glass unguentaria, simple bronze rings, and one child buried with a small clay lamp decorated with a Christian chi-rho. The genomes extracted from those late Roman Shkoder individuals tell a crucial middle chapter. They still carry the same Iron Age Western Balkan core, but now a small but detectable new component appears, an ancestry linked to the Eastern Mediterranean and, more faintly, to Anatolia, likely reflecting the movement of people within the Roman imperial network. The surprise buried in this detail is how small the Eastern input actually was. In the late Roman individuals from the Albanian lowlands, the Eastern Mediterranean ancestry component hovers around 5 to 12%, whereas in many other parts of the empire's European provinces, the local Iron Age ancestry had been diluted to below 40 or 50% by the same date. Place yourself beside the open grave of that child with the chi-rho lamp. The skeleton is tiny, the deciduous teeth still in place, and the excavator's shadow falls across the ribs as she measures the depth of the grave. The lamp's clay is still darkened with carbon on the nozzle. That child's genome contains the first faint echo of the wider empire seeping into the Western Balkan gene pool, yet the echo is much quieter than the one contemporary genomes from Roman Britain or Pannonia would shout. Compare the two numbers. In Britain, the Iron Age ancestry contribution to some early medieval populations falls to 30% or less in some regions, while in this late Roman Albanian grave, the Western Balkan Iron Age contribution still stands above 80%. The relative isolation is already visible. That isolation would soon be tested by a demographic avalanche, the arrival of Slavic-speaking groups, and the way the Western Balkan population responded to that pressure leads directly into the next revelation. The fourth chapter is written in the bones of a medieval cemetery perched on a limestone ridge in the Kruja Highlands, the very heart of the mountainous zone that the study identifies as the Proto-Albanian homeland. Radiocarbon dates place the graves between roughly 700 and 950 CE, the crucial centuries right before the name Albanian first surfaces in Byzantine chronicles. The genomes from this medieval cemetery deliver the headline number. Between 68 and 84% of the ancestry of these individuals derives from the Bronze and Iron Age Western Balkan populations we just encountered. The remainder is a modest blend of Southeastern European, Slavic-related, and very minor Eastern Mediterranean contributions that trickled in, not a flood. The startling side fact is what this number implies under a demographic microscope. For a population to absorb generations of newcomers and still retain such a high proportion of ancient local ancestry, it must have been far larger and more stable than the invaders' communities in that particular highland zone. Or it must have been geographically and culturally buffered in a way that diluted outside input to a slow drip. The microscene is a late afternoon in February at the Kruja Ridge excavation. A light sleet is falling, the kind that melts as soon as it touches the black plastic sheeting draped over the open squares. A bioarchaeologist takes a cotton swab and gently cleans the cortical surface of an adult male femur, sampling for isotopic analysis alongside the ancient DNA. The femur is robust, its muscle attachment sites pronounced from a life of walking steep terrain. The man it belonged to, the isotopes would later suggest, grew up within a day's walk of where he was buried. The two-sided number falls into place. If you compare the Western Balkan ancestry component in this 9th century Highlander to the same component in a contemporary lowland individual from the Danubian plain, the difference is striking. Roughly 78% in the Kruja individual versus perhaps 35 to 45% in the more heavily Slavicized lowland individual of the same century. The mountains acted as a genetic sieve, and the people who held that high ground would eventually be called Albanians. But the physical location of that high ground matters more than anyone had previously admitted, and it pulls the camera toward a specific archaeological culture, whose name rarely appears in popular histories. The fifth chapter emerges from a different kind of site, not a highland fortress, but a mountain settlement and its associated cemetery in the Mat River Valley, tied to what archaeologists call the Komani Kruja culture. This culture, known from distinctive jewelry, belt buckles, and ironwork, flourished between roughly the 6th and 9th centuries CE, and has long been ambiguously interpreted as either Romanized Illyrian, Proto-Albanian, or something mixed. The genomes from Komani Kruja sites dissolve the ambiguity. They are a near-perfect match for the genetic profile seen in the Kruja ridge samples, anchoring the Komani Kruja material culture directly onto the same ancestral population that leads into modern Albanians. The surprising side fact is that the Komani Kruja women's grave goods show stylistic links both westward to Adriatic Italy and eastward to the Byzantine interior, suggesting a network of contacts that contradicts the image of total mountain isolation. For a brief sensory moment, imagine opening a Komani grave on a humid June morning, the air thick with the scent of wild sage crushed underfoot. The coffin has long decayed, but the skeleton of a woman in her 40s rests in anatomical position, and beside her right hand lies a pair of bronze earrings, each ending in a small star-shaped pendant, still threaded with traces of linen that once wrapped them for safekeeping. The earrings look almost identical to examples excavated from Byzantine graves in Durrës, yet the woman's genome clusters firmly with the hyaline group. The comparison number is subtle but revealing. Strontium isotope ratios in her teeth, a different line of evidence, show that she was local, not a migrant from the coast, whereas the earrings clearly traveled. This suggests that genes and goods moved at different speeds, and that the medieval Albanian population was already participating in a wider world without being replaced by it. That insight moves the beam of attention southward and forward in time, into the era when historical sources finally start naming the Albanians and their language, and it is in this overlap between text and DNA that the pattern tightens. The sixth and final reveal chapter steps into the late medieval and early modern period between roughly 1200 and 1600 CE, sampled through individuals buried in churchyards and village cemeteries across the Albanian-speaking lands. The ancient DNA from these late medieval skeletons shows an ancestry profile that is essentially identical to the one calculated for the modern 74 samples of ethnic Albanians, with the Western Balkan Iron Age ancestry still holding at a level that makes the Albanian case stand out on a continental scale. The stunning side fact is the sheer persistence. Across almost 1,000 years, from the Kruj Ridge around 850 CE to a village graveyard in 1600 CE, the proportion of that ancient Western Balkan ancestry drifts by only a handful of percentage points, within the margin of error, as if the gene pool had found a new equilibrium and locked it in place. Imagine a stone church in a village near Korçë in the late 1500s. The priest keeps his records in Greek, but the names he writes, Gian, Leka, Mara, are Albanian. A young man is buried in the churchyard beneath a thin limestone slab, his head to the west. 5 centuries later, a physical anthropologist turns over the slab, exposes the cranium, and removes a tooth for DNA extraction. When the genome aligns, it falls squarely onto the same ancestral cline that connects the Iron Age Dalmatian tumulus builders, the late Roman Shkodër child, the medieval Highlander above Kruja, and the living Albanian college student who donated a saliva sample in Tirana. The overlapping datasets, ancient whole genomes on one side, modern genotyping arrays on the other, produce a genetic distance score between the late medieval and modern Albanian samples that is as low as the distance between 2 randomly chosen modern Albanian individuals from different dialect zones. It is a Scandinavian-level signal of continuity in a region of the world that textbooks have long treated as a byword for endless mixture and replacement. At this point, all the separate threads, the Black Sea outlier, the Dalmatian tumulus, the late Roman child, the Kruja Highlander, the Komani earrings, and the early modern parishioner, visibly converge toward a single narrow beam. The narrowing feels almost physical. You can sense the statistical weight of more than 6,000 ancient genomes pressing in on this one small territory, forcing the model to collapse its wide possibilities into a surprisingly tight solution. The last several thousand years of Western Balkan history, the Roman conquest, the Slavic migrations, the Bulgarian and Serbian empires, the Ottoman centuries, left fingerprints on the gene pool, but they did not erase the older pattern. Instead, the evidence narrows down to a specific geography: the mountainous zone spanning northern Albania, southwestern Kosovo, and parts of North Macedonia, and a specific timeline, the centuries around 800 to 900 CE, when a relatively small ancestral population carrying high proportions of Bronze and Iron Age Western Balkan ancestry consolidated into the biological core of the people who would later be called Albanians. The narrowing is visible in the ancestry charts the study publishes, where modern Albanian samples cluster tightly, overlapping with the medieval Kruja and Komani points, while populations from surrounding regions fan out in different directions. The data is done with generalities now. It points to a precise answer. Here is that answer. The genetic evidence confirms that present-day Albanians descend in very large part from the Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the Western Balkans. This descent is not a speculative link. It is a measured, quantified, statistically supported continuity that the study's authors phrase with careful confidence. The early medieval population that carried this ancestry did not wander in from a distant homeland. It was already there. It had been there, in the mountainous interior, long enough to absorb modest amounts of external ancestry without losing its deep genetic profile. And the modern Albanian gene pool, sampled across Geg and Tosk speakers alike, retains that same signal at a strength that is unusual in European terms. The title's promise, that Albanian DNA reveals a genetic story nobody expected, is not about denying the Illyrian narrative. It is about revealing the actual biological mechanism by which the narrative was achieved, and the mechanism is the genuine twist. The twist reframes everything the viewer has just absorbed. The popular version of the Illyrian origin story imagines a single, unbroken nation that has held its ethnic shape across more than 2,000 years, essentially unchanged through every invasion and empire. What the genes actually show is that the continuity was saved by a bottleneck, not by a demographic fortress. The traceable continuity runs through a comparatively small refuge population that consolidated in the highlands by about 800 to 900 CE, and only later did this population expand, linguistically and demographically, into the broader Albanian-speaking nation that history records. This is not a story of an unmoving monolith. It is a story of a tiny, resilient mountain group that carried an outsized genetic inheritance from the Iron Age Western Balkans, survived the great population turnovers that reshaped the lowlands around them, and then, centuries later, became the demographic engine that spread that inheritance to millions. The mechanism is a filter, not a wall. The historical irony is sharp. The very mountains that classical writers used to describe the Illyrians as backward and fragmented were the mountains that sheltered their biologic heirs from the worst genetic storms that swept the Balkan lowlands, storms of war, plague, and migration that erased other ancient genetic profiles. The bottleneck is paradoxical. For the genetic continuity to be so high today, the ancestral population had to shrink to a relatively small number of intermarrying families in a narrow upland zone, a process of near loss that enabled a later recovery. The Illyrian genetic legacy is real and spectacularly strong, but it was carried forward by a refugee population of modest size rather than by an intact, continent-spanning ethnic bloc. That reframing does not diminish the inheritance, it sharpens its outline. Independent confirmation comes from a completely different category of evidence: linguistics. The Albanian language is recognized as a distinct branch of the Indo-European family, with no close living relatives, and it preserves a layer of ancient loanwords from Doric Greek and from Latin that can be dated with some precision. The Latin loans, for words like pescus, for fish from piscus, or quitet, for city from civitas, exhibit sound changes that place them in contact with a form of Latin spoken in the Western Balkans during the late Roman period, roughly the first few centuries CE. The Greek loans are older, pointing to contact with Doric-speaking Greek colonists along the Adriatic coast in the first millennium BCE. This pattern fits the genetic narrative like a lock and key. The linguistic evidence independently demands that the ancestors of the Albanians were in the Western Balkans during the Iron Age, exactly when the genetic data places the majority of their biological ancestors there, and it demands further that they remained in the region through the Roman period, absorbing Latin vocabulary from a local dialect, while avoiding the deeper Slavic linguistic influence that reshaped so many other Balkan languages. Furthermore, the Roman-era personal names recorded on funerary altars in the Drin Valley and around the Mat region include both Illyrian-derived names and Latin names, tying the linguistic and onomastic evidence to the same geography that the genetics highlights. This convergence between language and genes, two independent archives of the past, is the strongest possible physical confirmation that the study is not measuring a statistical ghost. The biological mechanism behind the bottleneck deserves a closer look. A population that passes through a narrow demographic waste loses genetic diversity. It retains only a fraction of the variance that existed in its ancestor population. The early medieval Albanian population indeed shows signs of reduced genetic diversity compared to the broader Iron Age Western Balkan metapopulation, a classic bottleneck signature. But what the bottleneck filters out in breadth, it can intensify in depth. Certain ancestral components, in this case the Western Balkan Iron Age alleles, get enriched simply because fewer other sources are mixing in. The cost is a higher burden of rare recessive disease variants, some of which have been documented in medical genetic studies of Albanian populations, though the effect is modest. The benefit, from the perspective of ancestry tracing, is a signal that cuts through the murk of later admixture like a spotlight instead of a candle. Think of it this way. If the ancestral population of the early Albanians had been a large panmictic pool spread across the entire Adriatic coast, the Iron Age signal would have been diluted to a faint residue, maybe 10 or 15%, by the high medieval period. Instead, the Highland bottleneck compressed the signal, preserving it at that 68 to 84% level. The mountains acted as a genetic capacitor, storing charge during the chaotic centuries, and releasing it later when the population expanded again into the lowlands and cities. This is not speculation. The exact same mechanism has been mathematically described in other mountain refugia, the Basques in the Western Pyrenees, certain valleys in the Caucasus. But the Albanian case is now one of the clearest ancient DNA demonstrations of the effect in southeastern Europe. Honest limits must draw a clear line around the evidence. The study provides genetic continuity that is statistically robust, but it does not, and cannot, prove that a single tribe known to classical authors as the Illyriae Propriae Dicti were the specific biological source of the Proto-Albanian group. The genetic data covers a broad Western Balkan Iron Age population that almost certainly included multiple Illyrian-speaking groups, and likely Dardanian groups as well. The precise administrative and tribal boundaries between Illyrian and Dardanian identities in antiquity are historical reconstructions from fragmentary texts, not perfectly settled genetic facts. The 68 to 84% ancestry estimate comes with confidence intervals attached, and the exact number will shift as more ancient genomes from the exact region are sequenced. Some of the earliest published results on the Barsa Roma individuals initially circulated in preliminary excavation reports that predated the final peer-reviewed publication, and the archaeological assumption that those individuals were Central Asian was based on material culture, not on genetic testing, which is precisely why DNA testing can revise excavation reports. The theory that the Proto-Albanian homeland was in the mountainous north, not in the coastal lowlands, is a synthesis of genetics, linguistics, and archaeology, and not every scholar in the field agrees with its precise borders. This is the nature of a living scientific question. The core finding, the high continuity from the Western Balkan Iron Age into the medieval and modern Albanian gene pool, however, rests on a solid foundation of multiple lines of independent evidence. Now let the lens pull back and find you in the frame. You have inherited a genetic library whose oldest volumes were written not in a distant Asian steppe or a forgotten Caucasian valley, but in the limestone and oak forests of your own Western Balkans. The mirror moment is this. When you look at the faces of your own family, your parents, your children, your cousins who speak a different Albanian dialect but share your grandmother's eyes, you are seeing the biological echo of a small, stubborn group of highland families who held fast in the mountains around the year 850, while the world around them was being rewritten. They were not a legendary nation in waiting. They were a real, fragile human community, burying their dead with Komani earrings and Chiro lamps, raising children on steep pastures, speaking a language that would one day ripen into the tongue you used to say your first word. The genetic thread that connects you to them is not a myth. It is measured in the identical by descent segments that your genome shares with a 9th century man from the Kruge Ridge, and the segments you share with an Iron Age woman buried under a Dalmatian tumulus 1,000 years before him, and the thin silver fibula of the Roman-era individual at Apollonia Pontica who was part of a wider Balkan world you still belong to. And buried inside the same soil that held your ancestors, the soil of Barsa, lay a different human thread entirely, the remains of 3 individuals whose South Asian ancestry makes them the oldest known ancient DNA evidence of the Roma people in Europe. That discovery was an accident, a misclassification corrected by the sequencer, and it reminds you that every genome contains a story that can overturn what the archaeologists thought they knew. The circle of the master loop closes here. The small highland bottleneck of 800 to 900 CE was not a break in the Illyrian line. It was the reason the line survived at all. The narrow gate that looked like a vulnerability was the very thing that preserved an inheritance strong enough to still be visible in your own body today. What has stayed silent in your own family history that a single tooth might one day say aloud, and what would you want it to reveal? Tell us in the comments.